headlines pouring in the United States this weekend and all around the world as Syria's President Bashar al-Assad fled the country for Russia, where he now is, as we are told that rebels and the Syrian army have announced the end of his 24-year-old regime. The Syrian rebels capturing the country's capital of Damascus. Here to discuss what this news means and so much more, we bring in Joe Kent now. He's a retired Green Beret combat veteran and a Gold Star husband. Joe's wife was killed in Syria. Joe, good to have you with us today, sir. Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we get this news. Assad has been displaced, and now I'm seeing that the new leader, at least the rebel leader who is kind of in charge of the whole thing, has been a member of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and al-Nusra. So tell me how this is a good thing for the United States or anyone.
It's not. We should be very wary of what comes next in Syria. No doubt Assad was, by any measurement, a brutal dictator, but he did not pose a direct threat to the United States of America. Now, these so-called rebels are just a rebranded version of Al-Qaeda and in many cases a rebranded version of ISIS. The guy they're rolling out right now in front, Mohammed al-Jawlani, he spent a lot of time fighting Americans in Iraq. We even detained him for a period of time in Iraq, and then he went over to Syria, joined ISIS, split off from ISIS just a few years ago. He was swearing allegiance to Ayman al-Zawahiri before he was killed, the leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's number 2. And that's who's now running the country. So we should be very apprehensive about what comes after Assad.
Yeah. Well, I saw that CNN did an interview with this guy a couple weeks ago, al-Jawlani, and he claims that he's a changed man. He doesn't really agree with the tactics of the terror organizations that he's associated with. He's associated with the worst of the worst, as you just laid out. And then President Biden himself came out this weekend and signaled his support for the rebel takeover of Damascus and had this to say, kind of in a vague way, about al-Jawlani.
Make no mistake. Some of the rebel groups that took down Assad have their own grim record of terrorism and human rights abuses. We've taken note of statements by the leaders of these rebel groups in recent days, and they're saying the right things now. But as they take on greater responsibility, we will assess not just their words, but their actions.
I've never seen a politician do this. Lifelong terrorists are now saying the right things, so we're cautiously optimistic? What is that?
It's just absolutely absurd. I mean, he's saying the quiet part out loud. Under the Obama administration, we launched a disastrous covert action program that's now been declassified that funded a lot of these different factions. We drew the line at ISIS, but we were supporting known elements of Al-Qaeda, Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, which is now the current organization, because they were working against Assad, and we were looking to topple Assad and kind of deal a strategic blow to the Iranians and to the Russians. We cozied up with these jihadis. And now we're just sort of supposed to take the jihadis' word for it that, look, they've changed and they're saying all the right things. Again, look, we've seen this movie before. We saw what happened in the aftermath of Saddam being toppled, Gaddafi being toppled in Libya,
yes,
Mubarak in Egypt. And look, these jihadis, a big debate that the jihadis have always had is, do we go full-on jihadi right away and start chopping off heads and imposing Sharia? And that's the tactic that Al-Qaeda in Iraq and ISIS took. But then you've had a much more subtle version through the Muslim Brotherhood that says, hey, we need to effectively govern first, and that's how we get our foothold, and then we can launch more sophisticated terrorist attacks against the West. And that was more of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda's approach. And so I think we're right now back to the more Al-Qaeda Muslim Brotherhood approach that we're seeing here in Syria being rolled out by Jawlani. So a lot of the people in the mainstream media that are saying, hey, this is great, the Syrians now have their freedom back. Again, we've got to take that with a lot of skepticism and be very wary of America's involvement here. And keep in mind, we still have American troops deployed in Syria that are in harm's way right now.
The United States began conducting dozens of airstrikes yesterday on targets inside of Syria. That's the Biden administration started launching missiles in Syria. And the claim by U.S. Central Command is that they hit over 75, quote, known ISIS and al-Sham ISIS camps and operatives in central Syria. They struck the targets to, quote, disrupt, degrade, and defeat ISIS and render it incapable of exploiting the nation's current state to regroup in central Syria. So what the Biden administration is telling us here is, in the wake of this chaos that's already taking place in Syria, they're firing missiles into the country in order to bring about peace. Does that make sense?
They're trying to make it seem like there's still a massive ISIS threat inside of Syria to justify us keeping boots on the ground. When the fighting broke out earlier this weekend, CENTCOM announced they were doing so-called self-defense strikes, defending American troops that were deployed with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the Kurdish umbrella group. And they did those against Iranian-backed militants. Now, the Iranian-backed militants are part of the Iraqi government that we fund, that were over there propping up Assad. And so we did airstrikes against them. And then once we did the airstrikes against them, who filled the void was a lot of these jihadis that are part of Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, and maybe some are affiliated with al-Qaeda. And now we're just saying, oh, look, al-Qaeda's back, and now we can't leave. It's further justifying our presence there in Syria and trying to get us even more deeply entrenched into this as President Trump comes back into office.
So it's long been kind of a policy of the United States, or if not said out loud, certainly unspoken, that they want to get rid of Assad. That has now occurred. Do you think it's a coincidence that this is taking place in the intervening time between the election and Inauguration Day here in the United States?
No, not at all. Look, they wanted to make sure that they could get this final disastrous regime change done before President Trump came in, because Trump attempted to get our troops out of Syria on two separate occasions. He said publicly this past weekend, this is not our fight. I think that Washington, D.C., the military-industrial complex, the intelligence community, they knew that Trump was going to come and pull the plug on this and really start putting our interests first. And so now, again, they've gotten us into this very big quagmire that's going to be very hard for us to extract ourselves from, and it makes things much more dynamic. Again, look, Assad was a bad guy, but we've seen what happens when there's a power vacuum, when these leaders are taken out. It hasn't turned out well for us. It hasn't enhanced the security of the region. And it's actually made more.
You still there with us? Can you hear me? Joe Kent.
Between the election and between inauguration to attempt to get us further embedded into this conflict.
You broke up a little bit there, but what were you saying? What is the Biden administration doing between the election and the inauguration?
Oh, I think they are trying to get us more deeply embedded into this conflict. They knew that Trump was going to come and get us out of this conflict. And so right now they want to get us in the situation of our troops out in the east embedded with the Kurdish forces. They want them to have a more permanent mission there. So they're saying, well, ISIS is back. We can't get out. Things are too uncertain. Because they knew that Trump was going to end this whole affair, because really at the end of the day, Assad did not pose a direct threat to America. And so now instead we've gotten rid of Assad, and now we have a regime in power that could most certainly pose a direct threat to America. And so it's going to prevent us from withdrawing our forces away from Syria.
So to what extent do you anticipate, and I think this is kind of the point you're getting at, that this new regime in Syria, whatever it ends up shaped up as, will result in a rise of a terror threat equivalent to ISIS, that something like that, this is a vacuum meaningful enough for real terrorists to fill it?
I'd say it's more likely than not. I mean, look, these guys are rebranded al-Qaeda. They may have different tactics than ISIS. They may not go full on, Sharia and slaughter of minority groups right away, but they are most certainly going to use their control of Syria, all of its resources, its very strategic location on the Mediterranean, next door to Israel, next door to Turkey, on Europe's doorstep. They're going to use that as a way to plan terror attacks and to launch terrorist attacks against the West. Every time we give the jihadis the ability to control ground, whether it's Afghanistan after the Soviets withdrew, or whether it's Afghanistan now after we withdrew, or whether it's under ISIS in Iraq and Syria and Libya, this is exactly what happens.
And also, just for as far as Israel is concerned, I'm not certain how this helps them exactly. Hamas is praising the Syrian rebels. They're thrilled with this. I think a lot of the conventional coverage right now is that because Assad was so closely linked to Iran, therefore it's good for Israel that Assad is deposed. But it does seem like kind of the new terror leadership of Syria is not that interested in doing any favors for Israel.
No, I mean, I would caution, our Israeli allies. It's a temporary tactical victory. They cut off the way that Hezbollah was resupplied by Iran via Syria. that's a small tactical victory. But overall, I don't think it benefits Israel's security to have jihadis running the Syrian government. Assad was many things, but at the end of the day, the guy was pragmatic. He cared about his power. I do believe you could cut a pragmatic deal with him, but I don't believe there's a deal to be cut with rabid jihadists. So I think in the long term, this is going to end up being a much bigger threat for Israel than Assad was.
And I don't know if you have any thoughts on Tulsi Gabbard. You know, I know she's on the Hill today. The left, kind of in a low IQ assessment, was mocking her this weekend as, and Russia and Assad and Putin and sort of the basic sort of attacks that they launch against her constantly. She's a veteran who cares about the country and is always arguing for how can we bring about a peace. What do you think of her and her role as a top intelligence official for President Trump?
I couldn't think of someone better to be at the helm of our national intelligence apparatus right now than Tulsi Gabbard. She has been right about Syria, about Russia, about all these different very critical aspects of our national security for a very, very long time. She's always had a very America first approach that aligns with President Trump's worldview, the same worldview the American people voted for in a landslide. And look, Tulsi's willing to go and not just put her life on the line as a soldier like she did in Iraq, like me and so many of our generation, but also when Obama was trying to get us deeply involved in a proxy war in Syria that has turned out to be a disaster, she went and got ground truth for herself. She went and actually had dialogue with Bashar al-Assad. And that is actually something that we do in the intelligence community. We go and we talk to our enemies and we try and get inside their head. So I can't think of someone who is better qualified to lead our intelligence community at a time like this than Tulsi Gabbard.
All right, awesome. Joe Kent, thank you very much. Retired Green Beret combat veteran, Gold Star husband, former congressional candidate. Always so nice to talk to you, sir. Thank you very much for that.